Hello, and welcome to In Session, Capture's live series streaming across 5 platforms where EdTech leaders discuss innovation and the latest issues and trends affecting higher education, specifically in enrollment management and college recruiting. I'm your host, Leonard Napolitano, Capture CEO. Capture is finding new ways to bring the industry and community together. Our behavioral intelligence platform supports enrollment leaders as they confront the challenges of the pandemic by identifying and communicating with prospective students in today's virtual environment. In Session is another way Capture is working to create connections with relevant content. During these conversations, I get the opportunity to speak with enrollment management experts, leaders, and innovators from across the higher education landscape about issues universities are experiencing during the new, rapidly changing era of college recruiting. The goal of each of these sessions is to provide our community with ways to succeed in these transformative times. Enrollment and marketing leaders are expected to be innovative during a highly disruptive period. I want our listeners to be able to leave today's discussion with some things to consider for their organizations. Today, I welcome Dr. Matthew Pittinsky and Mr. Greg Davies to talk about innovation, leadership, strategy pivots, and perhaps even their favorite Glee episode. Lastly, to the hundreds of listeners out there, feel free to submit a question via the live chat, and be sure to register to receive our follow-up information about this and future sessions. Gentlemen, welcome to In Session.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn.
The excitement is telling. I first want to start with Matt. Matt, co-founder of Blackboard, seated on numerous academic governing boards. You then become a teacher or instructor at ASU and have the idea to create Parchment. What drove you to that decision, and what was missing in the market at the time that said, you know what, we're doing this?
Yeah, so first off, I didn't start Parchment. We have a great set of co-founders that we celebrate. For me personally, though, the ideas that drive Parchment, the mission of helping to turn credentials into opportunities, to a certain extent was incomplete work from Blackboard. So at Blackboard, we tried to help improve teaching and learning through technology, obviously only as good as the faculty member using it. And you can see over the years how universities have invested so much in technology to improve the teaching and learning process. And the credential that you get at the end of that degree program hadn't really been touched or innovated much. So an academic transcript talks about courses and credits. A diploma just tells you your name and degree. And so it felt like there was this disconnect between all the ways in which technologies like Blackboard and other systems were improving how well a university could assess and communicate what someone knows and how well they know it, and what the actual credentials reflected. So helping to turn credentials into opportunities is about innovating transcripts, innovating diplomas, innovating digital badges and other credential types, so that learners can better represent educational outcomes, whether it's for enrollment pathways, a high school student going to college, or employment pathways, a high school student or college student going right into the workforce.
Thank you. And Greg, I must ask a similar question of you. You too were, have been an innovator. You were one of the founding employees of Blackboard. You leave Blackboard to start a company called Presidium, which revolutionized the student service from IT support to financial aid and enrollment management. And then you say, I'm going to do it again with Full Measure. What was the driving factor behind that?
Yeah, great question. I think the driving factor behind starting Full Measure 7 years ago was, a lot of the stuff that we learned at Presidium, right? We were taking millions and millions of student phone calls across the student life cycle, hearing some friction that, maybe wasn't wonderful, hearing, a little bit of frustration in students as they tried to access administrative services. And we looked at what was going on in terms of what were the capabilities of mobile devices to simplify and remove friction and increase, positive momentum at certain points in the student journey. And so this really was born out of, a lot of what I learned in my last business in terms of could we put together, a platform on which institutions could quickly deploy, very simplified mobile experiences that allowed students to make better decisions along the way, clear hurdles that they maybe weren't clearing before, and at the same time reducing costs for institutions. So I think that was, Presidium sort of laid the framework for what we're doing now at Full Measure.
So I want to go to my first question, and I'll start with you, Matt. But both of you have been associated with disruptive ideas and innovations. Can you share one of those disruptive ideas you implemented that succeeded when you actually had little buy-in? And what course of action did you employ to generate consensus, even though you were still charging ahead to doing it?
As I think about it, there aren't many times, at least in my career, that I feel like, you have this sort of view of the kind of heroic innovator who other people all say we should go in this direction, and she or he says we should go in this other direction, and then they turn out to be right. And the times when I have been on the other side of an idea, probably I've been wrong more of the times than I've been right. So let me just say this with that humility. But the one that jumps to mind, we have a very active high school network. So at this point, a little under 30% of high school enrollments across over 1,000 districts use Parchment so that students can submit electronic transcripts and supplemental admissions docs to universities. Now, there are also other services, of course, that high schools use. They may use Naviance and the eDocs module. They may use Zello. They may use Chialfo. They may have other systems. And historically, to a certain extent, we're partners with them, but we kind of view them as competitive too. And it just sort of hit us one day. The problem we should be solving is the problem of the admissions office. And how do you allow them through one inbox to be able to get all of the electronic transcripts and admissions documents outside of the Common App that they may be receiving from high school students? And to really do that, we shouldn't be fragmenting. If you use Parchment at one high school, then it goes through that inbox. If you use Naviance at a different one, it goes through a different system. We really should be partnering with all of these different services. So we launched something called the Unified Inbox, where we now partner with Naviance, Zello, Schoollinks, Chialfo, Maya Learning, BridgeU, a lot of the different systems that high schools use, so that even if they're not using Parchment, ultimately they can be delivered through our network to the admissions office, and now the admissions office can lean on one account, one workflow to get security and efficiency for those credentials. But it was a bit controversial because, again, in some cases, those different services were viewed as competitive or substitute solutions at the high school level. So if you work with the high schools, you'd say, wait a minute, you're giving away something really valuable, which is the receiver network, the admissions network. But we really felt like it was important to solve the problem of the admissions office. And once you had that focus, it made all the sense in the world.
Greg, how would you respond?
I mean, I think I agree with Matt from the standpoint of I've never had that aha moment where it wasn't sort of obvious to others that this was a good idea, right? I mean, I think it takes some information for me to be able to, to make one of those decisions. I have lots of experience implementing ideas where there's no buy-in, but that's usually related to my children as a father of three. I also think, working at Blackboard early on, there was someone there, and you all know who I'm talking about, who taught me early on, you should never go into a meeting and pitch your own idea. You should pitch everyone else who's going to the meeting on your idea in a way that makes them think it's their idea, so that they pitch it back to you in the meeting, and then you agree with them. And I think Michael was the master of the socialization of ideas, so that there was never anything coming into a meeting that was like, this is me and I'm saying this. It was more like a group trying to bring an idea together. And so I've certainly tried to emulate that, not to the degree that Michael was masterful at that type of sort of management style when it came to new ideas. But that would be a good example of how I've sort of tried to approach, never finding myself in a situation where I've had to slam my fist on the table and say, I'm doing this because I think it's right, even though you all think it's wrong.
So I'm going to bring it to another question, because I think we've all been around many leaders. College leaders are assessing right now the landscape and trying to answer, where do I pivot? How do I pivot, right? The notion of we're no longer doing on-campus tours, so I have to pivot to something else. Students are becoming test optional. I'm going to have to pivot, for maybe a way to access, those interested students. So can you share a time when you had to make that significant pivot? And what were some of the indicators that you used? and the results that, that as you're looking back, maybe that you would have changed. But as they're going through this decision-making process, the hundreds of leaders on listening today, they're able to say, you know what, I could take a few of these points and maybe assess the decisions I'm looking at making.
You want Greg to go first on that one?
Greg can go first.
Happy to.
Yeah.
I think this is obviously a very difficult time right now. Everyone's having to make, a lot of, pivots and adjustments, and so many external factors are changing so fast. And I think, it's much scarier to place bets, in that type of an environment. Sometimes you're pivoting because of internal factors you have more control over, but this is sort of being hoisted on us. And I think in situations like this, speed matters maybe more than everything else. Look at the available data, make a decision, drive it forward as fast as possible. And I think, by all means, keep checking the wins, but once you pick the lane, just don't jump out at the first sign that something might not be perfect. And I think that's, you got to give the, whatever pivot you go into a little bit of time to harden before you, start making those adjustments. And I've seen some, how it kills morale and, and kills confidence and leadership when you see a pivot followed by a mini pivot, et cetera. And so I think that's one of the big, no-nos that you've got to avoid. And we happen to be working with a lot of schools in the reopening area right now. And so I'm seeing a lot of the decision-making and, and I'm part of a lot of those decisions that were made. And I don't think I saw a wrong decision be made in terms of, yes, reopen, no, go online or go virtual. I think the only wrong decisions I saw were those that put their resources into reopen. And then as soon as 11 volleyball players got COVID, they shut the school down and went back to, all online. I think they had picked reopen. And we have a lot of customers who reopened, who were serious about reopening, who had serious plans, serious processes, put serious tech in place, or on top of it, and they're doing very, very well. And we had customers who didn't reopen, and they put the ones that put serious time into things like connecting students to the food pantry, mental health resources, tech resources for those that, we have institutions with students in, Southern Louisiana who've now lost power for 2 weeks. And so how do we get, them to the library with Wi-Fi to get connected to their online courses and things of that nature? So, I think, I don't know that I necessarily answered your question, but I think at a time like this, I'll go back to, you're getting new information all the time. You got to take the information that's available to you, make a decision, and sort of execute everyone else. And so, I'll go back to Louisiana one more time. In Southeastern University in Louisiana, they're out, in admissions right now tabling, and they can't hand out paper. They're in a contactless environment. And so they've instituted text-in keywords and QR codes that can be scanned to get program information on your mobile device so that you're not, taking paper home from them. And so I think there's some schools that are doing some really innovative, pivoting to, that's paying off for them in terms of what they're seeing in terms of results.
Matt, how would you respond?
Yeah, I think I would pick up on something that Greg said, sort of the pivot after pivot after pivot. I think, again, we think in the world of innovation of these sort of heroic pivots where, Slack is a great example where the team was working on a very different business, developed Slack in the context of internal communication. The light bulb goes off that this thing we built to do this other thing turns out to be an amazing product, and pivot to make that the basis of their business. That's a kind of transformative pivot. I think in kind of the plain English use of the term pivot, more often it's about, we're still working towards that same goal. We're just constantly adjusting how we get there. So if I'm focused on how do I provide safe, secure, effective learning, that's not a pivot, right? I mean, we always cared about that. The difference is we could take it for granted to a certain extent. We had it locked down in a way that then made, A, B, C, D, E, and F, other projects, other priorities. And a lot of the pivots today are about getting back to basics. They're about focusing down on first principles. So in the case of Parchment, we obviously did not expect to have a pandemic this year. We had just finished we announced a major merger on January 30th with Credential Solutions to create the new Parchment. So it's the same name, but it's the combination of the two companies.
I like that.
And as you might have imagined, our game plan then was to do all these things that would take advantage of the combined organization, bring the best of both products, rapidly innovate and upgrade and so on. And so our pivot is, no, this is a time to just focus, like we should be as invisible as possible for the schools that have us, that we're just reliable, We're there when you need us, but we're not taking attention from you when you don't. We're not talking to you about doing 5 or 6 or 7 more things because you've got, first principles to focus on. And then for the schools that maybe they used us for electronic, but they didn't use us for print fulfillment, and they can't get to their campus to do print fulfillment of transcripts or diplomas, then we're there to support you. Or maybe you're a university that still hadn't adopted electronic ordering and fulfillment, then we're there to help you. So our pivot, I think, is about being, somewhat humble and there when you need us and visible when you don't, reflecting that there are bigger priorities, than our next greatest thing that we think is super important.
So I hear about speed that matters, constantly adjusting, going to your core first principles. And with that being said, when you think about the next area of innovation, higher education enrollment, what piques your interest? I mean, this is open for both of you, perhaps for debate.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you the two that we think a lot about, and one that I'm personally very passionate about. So the one that I'm personally passionate about and the company thinks about is credit transfer. So we evaluate higher education as a sector, evaluates about 100 million credits every year, spends about $800 million doing it. And it's a process that while there are some systems and software and technology that affect the overall workflow, sending it out to faculty for review or storing them, mapping the equivalencies, making them available, through the site to someone who's thinking of applying. Generally speaking, it's still underinvested and in technology and still pretty inefficient and inconsistent. And for a typical learner, the complexities that are associated with it, comparing a student who transfers credit versus a student who doesn't in terms of excess credit, time and cost to degree. Now with the pandemic, we're seeing higher rates of transfer. So in our data, we're seeing much higher rates of transfer. We're also seeing higher rates of graduate admissions applications for what it's worth. I just think it's one of those perfect storms that we're taking already a pretty leaky and inefficient and inconsistent process, and we're about to put even more. Then you take NACA exchange of rules, which allow institutions to recruit out of others, and then presumably that's going to have implications for credit transfer. So credit transfer is a big one, and then the second one is we're constantly thinking about how can we take our high school network and connect it to admissions offices in ways that allow the high school recruiter, the admissions representative who goes out and visits high schools normally and now has to do it in a more virtual way. How can we connect counselors to admissions representatives more efficiently?
Thank you, Greg. Follow that one.
Oh, and I'm the one who muted myself and then started talking. You'd think we were far enough into the pandemic that wouldn't happen anymore. There is one thing that that anyone who works with me knows that I've been obsessing about for a long time and trying to get into the market, which is sort of, we're a student journey focused companies. We sort of look at the student life cycle and say there are moments all along the life cycle, and can we build a mobile component that's, elegant and meaningful and does something really special in that moment. And for me, it's the moment of the first expression of interest in the prospective student life cycle. And not to get too highbrow here, but there's a French philosopher, Jacques Ellul, who said, 70 years ago, that excessive data doesn't, enlighten the user, it drowns them. And I think a lot of times in that moment of first expression of interest, I go to a website or a content channel or a communication channel, and there's so much data that's thrown at me, right? And so we're sort of working on, how do we make those early interactions between an institution and a prospective student? How do we make sure we don't drown anyone in those moments, right? And so, the work that we're doing is sort of built out of a belief that everyone brings with them sort of a set of, interests, goals, motivators, values, and needs when they approach an institution. And we want them to be met with, there's a deep set of capabilities at an institution. Many of institutions can meet the needs of every student, but how do I surface the sort of those affinity points? How do I make those connections? My ability to finance my education, my past recognition of my past military service, my desire to participate in social change initiatives, my real need to plan a good ultimate Frisbee team, whatever it is, right? My home life, concerns or my work concerns. And so, we've spent a lot of time over the last months, and we're still working on it. It's not ready. Can we learn what matters to the individual and then help them find those areas of strength in the institution before they sort of mosey along to the next institution? So, today I think, a lot of institutions build like long form RFIs to try and, sort of learn more, or they connect microsites to email campaigns and then track clicks and sort of glean knowledge that they can then, kick them into, drip campaigns downstream. And it works. I mean, it works. It's better. It's certainly better than not personalizing the experience at all. And so, but I think, what we're looking at is sort of, can we deliver a simple mobile experience that allows the first few taps on mobile content about the institution to curate the next few content options, and present more quickly, build that affinity, connecting an individual's sort of choice drivers to the strengths of the institution most aligned with them. And I think, can we learn and adjust by the second rather than by the interaction, right? So normally it's like, hey, I've personalized what I'm saying to you by the fifth time I talk to you, but can I do it in the fifth second that you're moving through a content stream? So how quickly, can I build real affinity between, prospective students, sort of, choice drivers and institutional strengths? And I think that's the project I've been working on for some time. We're going to get into the market. Can I get a STEM interested prospect connected to a championship winning autonomous aerial vehicle association or club on campus, in the first interaction, right? How quickly can I connect a veteran to a really passionate veteran services coordinator on campus? How many taps on the mobile device does it take before I can learn that, right? So I can infer all these things from your, sort of behavior. And mobile is a great tool for taking inferences and then validating them in session, right? So I can do it really, really quickly. And so I think it's still a work in progress. When we get it right, I think it's going to be amazing. It's not, it's not something we're launching tomorrow, but I think that's the thing that I get fired up about most mornings. So thanks for asking that question, because I love to talk about it.
I'm glad. So, Greg, I have a follow-up question. U.S. Open or Wimbledon?
I mean, U.S. Open, of course.
Matt, Hello Dolly or Hamilton?
Star Trek. Actually, I was in Hello Dolly. Oh gosh, what was my character's name? It's at the tip of my tongue. I was in Hello Dolly in my junior year of high school, but I'm a pretty big Hamilton fan.
Thank you. Going to my next question.
Cornelius. I think I was Cornelius. Now I got to figure out if there's a Cornelius character.
As you Google search, as you use the Google, as I ask the next question, you guys have, visited thousands of campuses, spoken to hundreds of leaders. Is there an institution that you have observed or have worked with that you're like, what, they really are executing something disruptive with some promising results that I believe it's worth sharing, and this is why it piqued my interest? Greg, how would you respond?
Oh, so yes, I've been to hundreds. And I know
there's every child is your favorite child, so I will take that preface away. So, well,
this is a hard one for me because I love going to small town community colleges that are doing really cool things with corporate partnerships, like Brazos Sport College. I'll give them a shout out. In Lake Jackson, Texas, partnered with BASF, built a big P-Tech program on campus. There's like 14,000 process technology jobs in Brazoria County. Like that kind of innovation is really exciting innovation. We were Wyoming Catholic is a client of ours who uses our mobile tech to recruit students, but then takes all students' technology away while they're on campus. So they build a campus where you don't have a phone or a computer while you're on campus, which I just think is an interesting way, an interesting approach, to doing things. As it relates to, sort of more on topic, I think the folks we work with at Davis and Elkin in West Virginia and Dominican in Illinois are doing some really innovative stuff in enrollment right now. I think Clayton State in Georgia is a pretty good example. They're up double digits in undergrad enrollment this year. They're up even much more substantially in grad programs this year. And I think one of the big shifts there is been around simplification of process, right? I've seen from the point of view of the student, and I think that's an important differentiation, right? It's not necessarily about simplifying internal process. It's about simplifying decision-making process for the students and sort of, nurturing them along the commitment timeline, right? And so can I simplify each step so that I build commitment, starting earlier in the process? And I think the team at Clayton State has done some really interesting things in that regard over the last year or so. So I'll give them the shout out for that.
Matt?
So I'm coming to you just down the street, so to speak, from Arizona State University, and obviously they have a very well-earned reputation. So I'll try not to lead with them, because at some point it becomes kind of a cliche to talk about ASU in the context of disruptive innovation. George Mason comes to mind. David Burge there. I think what George Mason. That's right. If I remember,
my alma mater.
Yeah, but it's gotten a lot better. No, I'm just kidding.
It has gotten much better, much better.
That's what we all say about our colleges. So Greg and I are friends. We can make that joke. What strikes me about George Mason is the hard work that they're doing to really create, I think, something that Greg actually spoke to, which is that pathway, from, in this case, NOVA, Northern Virginia Community College, George Mason, into particular employers. Like, they're doing the hard program work, and other institutions are certainly doing this as well. But we tend to think of innovation and disruption mainly through the lens of technology. And I think in higher education, oftentimes the biggest impact is kind of the program level work to really, we can solve the technology problem of how a student moves across institutions, how their transcript and academic records move, and so on. It's that program alignment work to, what are you learning at the community college? How is it going to keep you on track to the degree here? And then how is what you're learning at the degree here going to keep you on track to what a major local employer is looking for out of graduates? And how do we have the feedback loop to know whether or not alignment is actually happening, and when it's not happening, why? And it's just fascinating to see the kind of just hard program level work of alignment.
Do you think what we used to call the traditional student gets an undeservedly large amount of attention as they are trending to become the minority of the U.S. College-bound population? Because as you see some of the new technologies or innovations, people talk about that 18 to 20-year-old student, but the 25-year-old now is the majority of our students.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of like, if you follow, which I won't pretend that I've done a ton of reading, but the idea of disruptive innovation coming from outside or the periphery of a market and then some kind of coming in. I don't know. I think it's less true today than it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago. It obviously varies a lot by institution. I mean, if you're a residential liberal arts college in New England, it's the opportunity cost of not having programs that serve that market, and the question of whether your core market is going to be sufficient. But I'm not so sure that is still true today. I do think most institutions of higher education fundamentally have to redefine themselves back to the core of being in the learning business across a range of credential types, from the formal summative 4-year degree program to things that are much more topical and micro-credentialing and badging and so on. And once you see yourself in the learning business, you recognize how much bigger that market is in terms of all of the individuals who want to access different kinds of educational programs, done in a distinctive way that only higher ed can do in terms of a liberal arts core and how you ask and answer questions and so on. And in that sense, I think, when institutions don't appreciate that broader market, they're missing opportunity. But I think most institutions now do appreciate it.
Greg, what are your thoughts?
I think there's still pockets of it. I talk to admissions offices every day and other departments on campus. I see less and less of it, far less now than 10 or 15 years ago. And you can just hear in the questions they're asking, and in sort of how they're building their plans and their programs. I think everybody recognizes, who today's student is. And again, I work with a lot of open enrollment institutions. They've known for a long, long time that's not their target population, except for a few, right? And so I see even with the 4 years a lot of a shift towards recognizing the demographic shifts in their incoming population.
I want to go back to a follow-up to a question I asked earlier. When you're in, we have a number of VPs of enrollments that are charging ahead with new ideas, directors of marketing, directors of admissions, deans of colleges who are saying, what, we're going to charge ahead. And as you think about some of those areas that you innovated, whether it was a policy, a procedure, and maybe you didn't get a result that you wanted, and you say, as you look back and you think about what that was, if there is a takeaway that you should tell someone, look out for this challenge, or go ahead, take that risk, double down on your focus, be smart, be speedy, but make sure you don't forget about this, because this could really bite you. What would that be? I'll let either one of you answer first, so you guys can fight over it, but my money's on Greg.
I'll happily jump in. A long time ago when I worked with Matt, he had an Atari 2600 in his office. Is that still true today, Matt?
Oh, I am very familiar with that Atari 2600.
I have my Atari 800 and I have my Atari 1040 ST, not to be specific.
So I have on my desk an OLPC laptop. I don't know if you all remember the Nicholas Negroponte's One Laptop per Child initiative from back in the day. I keep it on my desk as a reminder that even the best intentioned social plans fail, right? And in disruptive initiatives, you want to talk about a disruptive initiative, right? That's a $100 laptop in the hands of every child in the world. It included a hang crank to charge the battery, which was honestly one of the coolest things I've ever played around with. It was very cool. It also failed pretty fabulously. There's like 300,000 of them sitting in closets in classrooms in Uruguay right now. There was, no plans made for training, for maintenance, and things like that. And it didn't work. And I keep that laptop on my desk to remind me that that most innovations, no matter how well-meaning, fail to achieve their desired impact. And so, it's just not enough to create a technology capable of change if you don't understand, the motivations and goals of the products that are the users of your product, and sort of design it for their success. And I think I look at where I am right now, or where my company is right now, and in the last 120 days, 2% of the schools in the country have signed on to use our software, which has been just explosive growth for us, right? So we're seeing growth in new partners that are powering their mobile interactions and admissions at a rate that hasn't happened over years of doing this. It's the same software that we've been providing the market for years without anywhere near that adoption rate. So I think the difference is we took a really deep look at the users of our platform, and what were their goals, and what were their limitations, right? Time was a big one. Initiative fatigue was a big one, right? And we sort of redesigned a starting point for our technology. So everyone always said, we demo our approach and how you use it and what you can expect from it in terms of results, and everyone would say, I love your approach. I can see how this would make a huge difference for me, but not right now, right? It was just it was overwhelming to get started, right? And so we didn't change any of the features, any of the value proposition of the software, but we shrunk by a large factor. It's sort of the time and distance between signing up to use our software and seeing a real return on investment. And now you can launch something in days, very little work, high return, right? It's focused on one narrow but critical phase of the admissions life cycle. And from there, you can sort of add on, additional mobile, experiences. And so I think that, you can have a good idea and still fail, right? And so I think you have choices when that happens. You walk away, and sometimes that is the answer, And the second time, the second sort of option is, is you can take a different look at how you match your solution to the problem with, a real particular focus on the externalities that impact your success, and decide, are there tweaks that can be made that can allow you to deliver on the promise of your innovation? I'm more of like an Edison guy, right? I discovered lots of ways to not successfully add mobile capabilities to higher ed before I found, one that actually worked. So that would be my take on that question.
Yeah, it's interesting. Greg went right to kind of where my head went, which, I think the tendency is to try to spin up a lot of innovations and then kind of fail fast, and that's one aphorism. Another is the notion of this minimum viable product, where you don't want to sort of bloat it and overdo it. You want to try to keep it as lean and tight as you possibly can, but to still solve the problem and then learn and evolve. And I think the mistakes that I often make when things fail is not appreciating the viable part of the minimum viable product. That I get really excited that it can do A, B, and C. And I think that that's, a really exciting innovation. but not taking the time to appreciate exactly as Greg described, the context that it's going into. So you can, launch an analytics product and say, isn't this amazing? Like you can see this, this, and this that you've never been able to see before. But is it actionable? Is it dynamic? Are you going to go back to it often? Is it a one-time answer and you're done? What's the real value? And so taking, I think this is a time to do fewer things more fully, as opposed to doing lots of things. And the more fully part is, all about that kind of minimum viable product, ensuring that you have the right level of fit.
I'm going to advance to a question that is, maybe I did not put it on here. It's an extra question. Sorry, because I saw it on my paper. A lot of schools now are preparing for the rise of students who opt out of standardized testing.
Yeah.
How are your organizations dealing with this pivot?
Well, it has we think it'll have a major impact on Parchment in the sense that it makes the transcript even more of a singular source of the academic performance information that institutions need, not just to evaluate if they're in selective admissions, but also, we think that there's a lot of richness in academic transcript data for placing into first-year courses and doing other things. It really is remarkable that that institutions more often than one might think collect really rich data to make an admissions decision and then don't harness that same data post-matriculation to then guide that initial kind of onboarding into the institution and set them on their way to be academically successful. So we're thinking a lot about what does a test optional world mean? Are there ways of taking, one reason why those tests exist is the complexity or the difficulty of making common sense across lots of high school contexts of academic performance data. But this is a little bit of a different world, right? There still are things like the AP exams. There's things like the IB program. There are things like, the state Common Core based exams that it might not quite be the case as it once was, that you can't, create out of a high school transcript something that provides the discrimination in the generic sense of that word or differentiation capabilities that you get from a standardized test score, but still be tied to the richness of the academic transcript data. So we're thinking a lot from a data science perspective about ways of presenting the academic transcript that can help address some of the uses of the test score. There are also other ones. This audience will obviously be familiar with the role that ACT and SAT play in helping to, just get that first set of student profile data to be able to reach out. And that's important. Lots of students may not realize their college options. And so to help institutions proactively recruit them, I think is a net positive. And so what does it mean if students aren't going through that gateway universally? How do you avoid the refragmentation that makes it difficult for institutions to be able to discover students?
Greg? I think that was an absolutely perfect question for Matt because it aligns exactly with what his business does. Less so for us, but I will say, and I talked about this earlier. One of the things that we're, really
we allowed you to quote a French philosopher.
He's my only philosopher quote. Just to be clear, I'm not a deep reader like that. I talked about this earlier when I was talking about, our project around sort of that first point of first expression of interest. And then Matt hit on something that I've been, a big proponent of for a long time, which is we're gathering all this information about a student as we're as we're uncovering it. And then how do we then use it downstream, right? So the first advising session and other things, can you take this really useful information? And now that we're not going to rely as much in some instances, and I mentioned Clayton State earlier, they went test optional this year. On those sort of hard measures, and we're going to go to, all of this data is going to become more important. We're going to be forced to use it more meaningfully, make sure it's reflected well in our systems, our CRM, et cetera. Can we move it on to, from this point to, to those other sort of downstream moments in the student life cycle? So I think Matt said it brilliantly. I think it's going to be, that makes it an exciting time, I think, and a time where we can really make improvements based on some of this stuff.
Matt, before I ask the last question, I do have another question for you particularly. WWF or Sumo Wrestling?
I know the answer to that.
Yeah, I guess I have to go. Actually, I did enjoy my WWF in my youth, but those who may have seen a presentation that I gave back in the Blackboard days, one of my stock slides was 2 sumo wrestlers. So one sumo wrestler represented the internet, the other sumo wrestler represented education, and the impact of these two and all the ways in which, still today we're living the shift in how higher education works as a function of the internet in particular. So I'll go with sumo wrestlers.
Greg, Iceland or Mexico?
Oh, that's an interesting one. And for everyone else's benefit, we had 2 sales retreats at Presidium that Lenny and I participated in. One was at an eco lodge in Guadalajara, Mexico, and one was in Reykjavik, where we did an amazing race. I'll go eco lodge in Mexico.
Okay. And my last question for you both, what is the bravest decision you have made? Greg, I'll let you start, and then Matt can finish.
I'm going to assume you mean professionally.
Yes.
I was going to say proposing was
like dozens of daring things I've done in my life. I think they all qualify more in like the stupid kind of daring than like the brave kind of daring. For instance, Glenn, you are aware that I once survived a boat sinking in the middle of a lake in the middle of the night. However, I also caused the boat to sink. So I don't know that it was necessarily a brave act on my part as much as it was a stupid type of daring. So I'll stick professional here.
Oh, thank you.
I think I honestly think probably leaving Blackboard to start Presidium was probably one of the bravest things that I've brave is a strong word, but Blackboard was still early and on the rise. We were 6 years in, we hadn't gone public yet. There was still lots to be done. A lot of the uncertainty had been removed. Right, I'd just gotten out of like the uncertainty of will we survive, will we get our next round of funding, will we be a successful business, and then I thought I saw an adjacent problem, that was created by the explosion of, sort of that digital institutional resources, namely the need to provide support, to students for, sort of new digital avenues of institution access. And I jumped ship and started Presidium, and leaving Blackboard to try and start from scratch in a new business was definitely looked on, I think, as a bit out there at the time. And I believe one of our former colleagues, former Blackboard executive, who will deny it if ever directly questioned, referred to my new co as a 2-man dog and pony show that was destined to fail. That is a direct quote. And 7 years later, we had partnered with 800 schools. We had employed 1,400 people during peak times in communities in Kentucky and Texas that really needed those jobs. Throughout that time, we frequently internally referred to the company as D2F, as in destined to fail. It became sort of a rallying cry akin to the way, Washington's troops reappropriated Yankee Doodle Dandy, right? We turned it into something.
Red Dawn, Wolverine, I get it, the Patriot, love it, right? Yeah.
Yeah, there you go, right? So, but I think that would be, if I had to come up with something, I think, and it was also, by the way, one of the most rewarding things I ever did. So maybe brave, maybe just, a little bold.
Matt?
Well, now I really want to know, was I the person who said that?
I'll text you on the side. No, it was not you. It was not you.
Okay,
not you.
Good. Because I was thinking, no, just kidding. Like Greg, I mean, brave is a loaded word. I would say the most scared professionally was that first day of teaching at ASU. So, I had my experience at Blackboard. Prior to starting Blackboard, I think a week, not prior, but 2 weeks after starting the company or 4 weeks after starting the company, I took the GREs. That's how low my confidence was that we would be around a year later. So I was already getting ready for graduate school and what would have been my career plan, which was to be an academic in sociology of education. Eventually was able to earn my doctorate in sociology of education, and then start as a tenure track professor at ASU. And I definitely had sort of fraud complex of, I did a dissertation. I studied this, I could, talk Marx and Weber and Durkheim, knew the literature, knew my area. But that first day when you're standing in front of a group of students and you're the professor, Yeah, that definitely, that took a little bit of courage.
Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you for not only sharing us moments about yourselves, about your company, and just insights about the higher education landscape and ways that our audience participants can maybe go back and think about some of those ideas, synthesize and say, hey, what can I apply to my world? For all of our listeners out there, on behalf of the Capture team, our hundreds of clients, we want to thank you for participating in our inaugural session, and we look forward to seeing you later in the year when we host our second session. Thank you, everyone, for a wonderful first ever in session, and we wish you the best this year. Take care.